Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Community Planning and Development webinar, using state community development block grant funds to promote economic development. The call today will last about 90 minutes, and we'll leave time for question and answer at the end of the call. All the callers will be muted for the duration of the call, but you can type in your questions as you have them. And the slides for this webinar will be posted on the CDBG program website shortly after. Additionally, the webinar will be recorded for future use and made available for viewing and downloading. If you have any questions during the call, you can type them into the Q&A box at the top of your live meeting screen, and these questions will be addressed at the end. All the questions will be forwarded to the presenters, and any additional guidance will be developed by HUD on economic development. And now I'm going to turn the call over to Steve Roadside.
Thank you. From the State and Small Cities Studios, welcome to the State Community Development Block Grant webinar, using state CDBG funds to promote economic development. We're sorry for any confusion people had where to get on to this webinar, but we're smart people and you managed to get on or you wouldn't be hearing me right now. I'm Steve Roadside. I'm Director of the State and Small Cities Division and Headquarters, and I'm joined by Diane Labassa, the Senior Advisor in the Office of Block Grant Assistance, and James Heyman, CPD Specialist in the State CDBG Division. The State's Division is one of 4 divisions in the Office of Block Grant Assistance, which oversees the CDBG program. This webinar is the second in a series of 4 webinars which will be offered during the month of March. This webinar focuses on the state CDBG program. The remaining webinars on March 16th and March 30th focus respectively on economic development using the Section 108 program and case studies on economic development projects. You can email questions that you would like HUD to consider for the March 30th webinar to cdbgedquestions@hud.gov. The email address will be shown at the end of the presentation, so if you didn't hear it now, you can see it a little later on. During the presentation, you can submit questions about the materials we're covering today. All of the webinars are being recorded and will be available for future use on HUD's website in the near future. The slides are posted as mentioned earlier. I encourage you to work closely with your local HUD CPD rep if you have any questions regarding economic development or any other CDBG issues for that matter. Before we begin, please keep in mind that this webinar is an abbreviated overview of the CDBG regulations and policy regarding economic development. There are important details regarding how CDBG rules are applied to specific projects, which time does not permit us to cover today. This is especially true for economic development activities, which often trigger many complex regulatory requirements such as job counting and public benefit. You are encouraged to refer to the Housing and Community Development Act as well as the CDBG program regulations and CPD notices for additional information on the CDBG requirements. We are aware that there's a large number of entitlement grantees as well as an insular area and a non-entitlement county in Hawaii on today's webinar. Please be advised that today's webinar is being given from the state perspective and includes the requirements of the state CDBG program. The entitlements, insulars, and non-entitlement counties in Hawaii must follow the entitlement regulations, which are more prescriptive than the state CDBG requirements. We will let you know when the entitlement webinar script will be posted to the HUD website. There is a wide range of activities that are eligible under the Community Development Block Grant Program. One of the most common and most important CDBG activities is economic development. CDBG-assisted economic development programs are usually undertaken in order to create or retain jobs for low and moderate income people. During federal fiscal years 2005 through 2010, grantees created or retained more than 250,000 jobs by providing direct assistance to for-profit companies, providing technical assistance, and building infrastructure for businesses. States consistently create or retain the majority of the jobs in the CDBG program, averaging 68% over the past several years. Some economic development activities are also a key component in downtown revitalization. These statistics are particularly important because there are relatively few HUD programs or other federal resources that are specifically designed to create employment opportunities for low and moderate income people. Yet for many grantees, all of the other development activities that are critical to community vitality are predicated on assisted low and moderate income families obtain sustained employment that pays a decent wage. For example, homeowner assistance programs cannot succeed if the households don't have jobs that provide a steady income. So it is vital that grantees continue to meet both the needs of low and moderate income residents and the needs of local businesses through the provision of economic development activities that are compliant with CDBG requirements. HUD supports these grantee efforts by providing training and technical assistance on economic development and other CDBG activities. This webinar will cover key eligible activities related to economic development, including assistance to public and nonprofit entities, assistance to for-profit entities, commercial rehabilitation, micro-enterprise assistance, and infrastructure. In addition, national objectives, underwriting guidelines, public benefit standards, and other requirements will be highlighted. There is a broad range of economic development activities that are eligible under the CDBG program. Although people tend to think of economic development as a unique type of activity under the CDBG program, there are in fact several different ways or categories by which grantees can approach economic development. The first of these categories is comprised of two parts. The first is the development of commercial and or industrial buildings and space, such as the installation of water and sewer lines to attract businesses to a city-owned redevelopment park. CDBG may be used by units of general local government and nonprofits to construct or rehabilitate commercial or industrial buildings. These activities are limited in that they must be carried out by the unit of general local government or a private nonprofit organization. The second type of assistance is the provision of financial assistance to for-profit businesses. This category includes economic development activities that facilitate business creation or expansion. CDBG funds can be used for the purchase inventory, equipment, or rehabilitate commercial facilities. This also includes for technical assistance, accounting assistance, job hiring, and training assistance for individual businesses. Economic development can also be facilitated through the assistance designed to create or expand microenterprises. CDBG can be used to provide financial services, but also used to provide other support services essential to these existing small businesses or to persons desiring to create a new business. Grantees may also provide assistance to an in-home business for the purpose of rehabilitating a home and creating business space. Grantees may also support local businesses by working with the nonprofit organizations that serve the development needs of non-entitlement communities. Following slides will highlight these types of CDBG economic development activities. As we discuss these approaches, we will briefly highlight the associated national objectives and whether or not the activity will trigger the public benefit standards requirements. The standards are applied to certain types of eligible economic development assistance activities and are intended to ensure that there is sufficient public benefit from the investment of CDBG funds in an economic development activity. However, the public benefit standards do not apply to all economic development activities, as you will see when we discuss the standards later on in our program. Units of local government may undertake any of three possible types of economic development activities. First, the unit of general local government itself, or a public or nonprofit subawardee, may directly conduct real property activities related to economic opportunity. Unit of general local government or subawardee may acquire, construct, rehabilitate, or reconstruct commercial or industrial buildings, or it may acquire or install commercial equipment. As you can tell from this list, virtually any type of commercial real property activity is eligible under this activity for grantees and subawardees. One example of this type of project might be a farmer's market that's owned by a unit of general local government. Under this category, a unit of general local government could acquire and convert an old warehouse into a market. It could then rent out the stalls to eligible small businesses and farmers. Another possible example under this eligible category would be for a nonprofit subawardee to construct a business center. This would be a building that houses and supports small startup businesses. It's important to note that all of these activities must be related to a property. The provision of services is not eligible in this category. For example, while this overall category would allow the subawardee to construct a business incubator, this is not the eligibility category that would be used to pay for the business counseling or training that might be offered to the tenants, and is not used to pay for the operational costs of the incubator itself. These activities may be eligible elsewhere under CDBG depending on the project specifics. The next type of assistance is to for-profit businesses. The unit of general local government provides financial support to a business in return for that business creating some form of economic opportunity. The business may use the CDBG funds to pay for the costs that range from acquiring, rehabilitating, constructing a commercial site, all the way to inventory or business equipment. The business may also use these funds to pay for support type of costs such as business counseling or marketing assistance. So this category is much more flexible than our previous category because it's not solely tied to real estate and related costs. An example of this type of project might be for a for-profit manufacturing business that wishes to expand. Assume that in order to expand, they not only need a larger factory, but they also need new equipment. This eligibility category can be used to provide this assistance to the business. The final approach is services that are offered in conjunction with another economic development activity. Units of general local government may pay for costs reviewing and underwriting business applications as an eligible economic development cost. In addition, and perhaps most significantly, this category can be used to pay for job training and placement activities for the persons who are taking the jobs created by the related economic development activity. For example, imagine that a unit of general local government is providing CDBG assistance to a high-tech firm to expand its computer manufacturing facility. In order to hire additional low and moderate income workers, the business needs these people to be trained on how to use the complex equipment so that the grantee uses CDBG funds for training. This flexibility is important because it is a way to do targeted job training that is not under the grantee's public service cap. The related economic development activity does not need to be funded with CDBG dollars. For example, it might be a business expansion that was funded by the state industrial bond revenues. However, once CDBG funds are used to pay for economic development services, the project has become a CDBG-assisted activity, and the entire project must now meet CDBG rules. The entitlement CDBG regulations are very broad about how financial support for special economic assistance may be provided. They are not applicable to states, only subpart I is. They can be used as a safe harbor in of what is permitted under the statute. For example, the grantee could provide loans, grants, loan guarantees, and other financial instruments. The grantee may choose any or all of these financial tools depending on its policies in the specific project. The national objective for economic development may also vary depending on the project. Often these activities are funded under the low and moderate income job creation and retention national objective. However, some of these projects might fit under the low and moderate income area benefit activity or the area slums and blight activity. After we have discussed all of the eligible economic development activities, we'll cover objectives in detail. Use of the economic development eligibility category triggers public benefit standards. This includes economic development activities undertaken by units of general local government or subawardees, as well as assistance to for-profits and economic development services. These standards require that the economic development activity create a sufficient level of return for the CDBG investment. Return under public benefit is defined according to the number of jobs created, retained, or low and moderate income persons who obtained access to goods and services. We'll cover the public benefit in detail in a few minutes. The next approach to economic development is to provide technical assistance to businesses. This is a very common activity and typically involves training or one-on-one guidance to new or existing businesses to assist them to start up, expand, or stabilize. Common types of business technical assistance and training includes business planning, accounting, marketing, legal structures, or personnel and human resources. Technical assistance and training can be a very important part of an economic development program because it can help reduce the risk of business failures. Rather than simply providing financial assistance to a business, grantees often provide technical assistance or training. Thus, business TA is commonly coupled with CDBG or other financial support. In fact, in some communities, the business is required to participate in training classes or technical assistance before it can obtain CDBG financial support. This is particularly the case for programs that focus on small businesses, as we don't want the small businesses to fail, and the TA will help the small businesses become more successful. Often these CDBG programs are in partnership with various small business administration programs, such as the Small Business Development Centers. There are several different eligibility categories that can be used to pay for CDBG-funded business technical assistance and training programs. First, as we already discussed, under Economic Development Eligibility category, businesses can use CDBG assistance to hire experts to provide advice on key topics. However, it's important to remember that this is deemed to be in the business, and so it triggers all of the same CDBG requirements as other forms of CDBG assistance, including triggering the public benefit standards. Alternatively, business TA and training can be provided as a public service. Don't forget, however, that public service activities are subject to the overall 15% cap, and that's not a problem for states because very few states use a lot of public service at all. Finally, businesses' technical assistance and training can be provided via certain organizations. In the state CDBG program, these nonprofits are organizations serving the development needs of communities in non-entitlement areas, or are known as 105A15 organizations. These organizations are nonprofits that are providing community economic development, neighborhood revitalization, or energy conservation activities. If the business technical assistance is provided by a 105A15 nonprofit organization in a community revitalization strategy area, the costs for that technical assistance and training are outside of the public service cap. Otherwise, these costs also count towards the public service cap. Assistance by 105A15 entities is covered by the public benefit standards. In addition to these type of technical assistance and training that may be provided to any business, CDBG allows for some special types of assistance that will be provided to microenterprises. The next type of eligible economic development activity is microenterprise assistance. Under this eligibility category, grantees provide financial and or other assistance to small businesses which qualify as microenterprises. In a CDBG program, a microenterprise is a business that has 5 or fewer employees, including the owners. Note that unlike the low and moderate income job creation and retention national objective, this test is not based on the full-time equivalents or FTEs, but rather on the number of employees. For example, if a business has 6 part-time employees, this business will not count as a microenterprise. That being said, assistance to microenterprises must meet a national objective. Also, if the business had 6 part-time employees, you could give it assistance, but it would have to be done as a regular economic development project. It is also important to note that the definition of microenterprise under CDBG is different than the definition used by the Small Business Administration. The SBA bases its definition on the revenues of the small business. The CDBG program contains no revenue test when determining which businesses qualify as microenterprises. Unit of General Local Government, or Subaward E, wishes to combine these 2 funding sources, it needs to comply with both sets of rules. Microenterprises may be existing businesses that are looking to stabilize or expand. In addition, this assistance can be provided to a new business or to a person who is working towards opening a new business. There is a wide range of activity types that may be provided to the microenterprise. First, the unit of general local government may provide the business with financial assistance such as loans, grants, or loan guarantees. The business can use this assistance for a variety of costs, ranging from acquiring or rehabilitating a commercial property, to buying needed equipment, to paying for soft costs such as marketing or training of their employees. In fact, there really are no programmatic limits on how these funds may be spent, so long as the costs are reasonable and necessary under A87, and related to the business and not in violation of the costs prohibited in the CDBG regulations. Obviously, the unit of general local government may want to impose additional restrictions on its local program, and states may also want to have their own restrictions as to what the UGLOCs are allowed to do. In addition to this financial assistance, the unit of general local government may also provide technical assistance, training, and other advice to the business owner. Note that this special flexibility provided in microenterprises is outside of the public service cap. In addition, the unit of general local government may provide general support to the owner of the microenterprise. This would include costs to personally assist the owner, which would enable him or her to build or expand his or her business. For example, if the owner of the business needed child care assistance or transportation subsidies so they could get to and open the business, this could be provided under CDBG. This tremendous flexibility is outside of the public service cap and is categorized under the microenterprise category. It is often asked if these same services can be provided to the owner's employees outside the public services cap. While this particular subsection of the microenterprise eligibility category is specific to the owner of the microenterprise, the unit of general local government could provide financial assistance to the owner, and then the owner could use this financial assistance to pay for such services for his or her employees. These costs would also be categorized as microenterprise activity and not be a public service, and thus would not be subject to the public services cap. If the unit of general local government, with the subaward E, wants to manage a microenterprise program, the unit of general local government may pay for costs for those staff to enhance their capacity to do these activities. For example, the unit of general local government could use CDBG funds to pay for staff to attend an SBA conference when providing services to small businesses. This flexibility is particularly important because it's outside of the grantee's administrative cap. In addition to all of this flexibility in terms of the types of possible assistance, it's important to note that there is no CDBG limitation on how much assistance each microenterprise may receive. So a unit of general local government may elect to provide only technical assistance and training, or it could elect to provide substantial financial support. Obviously, the unit of general local government should develop program procedures to ensure that all CDBG project costs are reasonable, eligible, and necessary. Because microenterprise activities are their own eligibility category, they're not subject to the public benefit standards. The microenterprise activities are required to meet a national objective. However, there is special flexibility provided under the low and moderate income limited clientele national objective if the owner of the microenterprise is low or moderate income. The grantee can still assist owners who are not low or moderate income, but those activities must qualify under an alternate national objective. We'll talk more about the national objectives in a few minutes. I'm going to now turn this over to James Heyman, who's going to discuss commercial rehabilitation, infrastructure, economic development, job training, and national objectives. And while he's setting up, it's probably a good time for you to send in any questions that you may have so that we can answer them later.
The next type of economic development eligibility category is commercial rehabilitation. This category can be confusing because it sounds similar to special economic development activities as defined by the entitlement regulations in Section 570-203. However, there are significant differences between this commercial rehabilitation and special economic development. There are two ways in which commercial rehabilitation may be carried out. First, commercial rehabilitation is covered in the statute, Section 105A4. This section of the statute covers all types of rehabilitation, including residential rehabilitation. The statute permits activities that exclusively focus on rehabilitation of real property and not on all their costs that may be possible under other economic development categories, such as the purchase of equipment or the provision of TA. Moreover, it is important to note that the statute permits rehabilitation of commercial or industrial properties that are publicly or privately owned, and states may exercise maximum feasible deference to define what a commercial or industrial building is and the scope of the rehabilitative work to be performed. Second, states can rely on Section 570.202 of the Entitlement Regulations for interpretive guidance in the area of commercial rehabilitation. This section of the Entitlement Regulations imposes some significant restrictions on the type of rehab that may be performed under this eligibility category. If the building is owned by a private for-profit company, as most of these types of beneficiaries are, then the rehabilitation is limited to the exterior envelope of the building and interior code violation improvements. The unit of general local government cannot fund other types of repairs under the commercial rehab portion of the regulations. For example, a unit of general local government cannot replace the carpeting or paint the interior walls unless it somehow addresses a code violation. Because of these restrictions, performing commercial rehabilitation under the entitlement regulations is, for the most part, restricted to facade programs. For example, some unit of general local governments offer assistance to businesses located in Main Street or neighborhood commercial areas to improve the facades of their buildings that front onto the main shopping and pedestrian areas. If the business needs additional rehabilitation assistance beyond the exterior of the building and code violations, or if they need support that goes beyond just rehabilitation, these activities can be done under Section 570.203 of the Entitlement Regulations, which covers special economic development activities. So at this point, you may be wondering why states do not skip commercial rehabilitation and simply do all activities of special economic development. Since this is a much broader category and since it also allows rehabilitation, the primary reason that some units of general local government fund projects under commercial rehabilitation and not under special economic development, as described in the entitlement regulations, is because commercial rehabilitation is not subject to the public benefit standards. We'll talk more about the implications of this distinction when we cover the public benefit standards. Note that both commercial rehabilitation and special economic development must meet a national objective. The possible national objectives that may be applied to commercial rehabilitation are the same as those that are available for special economic development, except that under some limited circumstances, commercial rehabilitation can be done as a spot, slum, and blight activity, and special economic development cannot. Recognizing the language in Section 105A.15, the statute was not applicable to rural and small areas. The list of eligible entities was expanded in 1992 to include nonprofit organizations serving the development needs of communities in non-entitlement areas. Thus, economic development activities may be undertaken by these organizations provided that the nonprofit is organized under state or local law to carry out community development activities. The nonprofit development group needs to undertake the activity directly or through contracts with an entity other than a unit of general local government. These organizations can only carry out the following activities. Number one, a community economic development project. Number two, neighborhood revitalization. You'll note that the state defines what a neighborhood is, but the definition should be consistent with the terminology used under the community revitalization strategy process. Or finally, it's an energy conservation project. Community economic development activities are projects or programs whose purpose is to promote job creation or economic opportunity. Neighborhood revitalization projects are those that are intended to help revitalize an area of sufficient size and scope to have an impact on the decline of the designated geographic jurisdiction of the community. And energy conservation projects are those carried out to conserve energy for the benefit of the residents within the unit of general local government's jurisdiction. 105A.15 nonprofits undertaking these activities have certain regulatory flexibilities under CDBG that other partners do not. As it relates to economic development, the most important flexibility is that any job training and placement efforts undertaken as this type of activity are exempt from the public service cap. However, economic development activities conducted by nonprofits must still meet a national objective. In addition, these activities are still subject to the public benefit standards if they would otherwise have been funded as economic development to a for-profit business pursuant of 105A17 of the Act. Next, we move on to infrastructure projects that are developed in order to enhance economic opportunity. For example, a unit of general local government might build a water and sewer line to an industrial area in order to entice businesses to locate in that area and create new jobs. Usually these types of improvements are publicly owned, so they qualify as a public facility. However, in some cases, the improvements are owned by the business that are on its site, such as on-site drainage systems. In this case, the activity is considered economic development assistance to a for-profit business. As with all other eligible activities, infrastructure for a business must meet a national objective. These activities are almost always done as a low-moderate income job creation and retention activity. However, it is important to note that there are special provisions that are applied to infrastructure projects that are qualified under the low-moderate income jobs national objective. If the cost per full-time equivalent or FTE job created or retained is less than $10,000, the grantee can simply add up the jobs that are created or retained by the specific business who directly received the infrastructure at the time that the project was funded. However, if the grantee obligates $10,000 or more per FTE created or retained, the low-mod jobs national objective is based not only on the businesses in place at the time the infrastructure is built, but also any other businesses who move into the service area within a year after completion of the infrastructure construction. This means that 51% of the aggregated FTE jobs created or retained by all these businesses must be held by low to moderate income persons. Because of the significant difficulties in implementing this, most grantees cap their investments in infrastructure projects related to the low to moderate job national objective at less than $10,000 of CDBG assistance per FTE. Finally, let's talk about job training activities. In many communities, job training is an important element of their economic development projects because they want to ensure that local residents have the skills needed to take the jobs they are creating. Sometimes these job training efforts are standalone classes that are not tied to a particular industry or a specific job. These classes tend to focus on basic topics such as resume preparation, interview techniques, or computer skills. In other cases, the job training is related to placement and is for a specific position or skill. Both approaches to job training are possible under CDBG. Note that when the CDBG program talks about job training, it usually refers to training for unemployed persons or underemployed persons seeking to obtain a different job. The term is not usually meant to refer to the business planning, TA, and training that might be provided to an owner of a business as part of an economic development project. However, under the microenterprise categories we have already mentioned, there are significant flexibilities for providing assistance to owners or micro-businesses, which might include giving them assistance which they use to train their employees. Job training may be undertaken under several different eligibility categories, depending on who is offering the assistance and its purpose. The most common way of doing general, not position-specific job training is as a public service. Units of general local government do have the option of providing job training as part of an economic development activity with a for-profit business. The cost associated with either activity would be subject to the public service cap unless the job training is provided by a 105A15 nonprofit organization. In addition, as I already mentioned, job-specific training may be provided as economic development to a for-profit business. This is outside of the public service cap but is subject to the public benefit standards. Finally, as we discussed, job training could be a part of a nonprofit 105A15 or a micro-enterprise activity. Obviously, all of these activities would need to be the national objective. We will now discuss national objectives. The grantee must remember that each CDBG activity must meet one of three national objectives. It either needs to aid, principally benefit low and moderate income persons, or it will need to eliminate or prevent slums and blight, or it will have to address an urgent need. Most economic development activities are conducted under the low to moderate income job creation and retention national objective. Under this national objective, the grantee must demonstrate that the activity created or retained jobs and that at least 51% of these jobs were for low to moderate income persons. The number of jobs that are created or retained is calculated on a full-time equivalent basis, or FTE, and these jobs must be permanent. To meet the national objective for new jobs, the grantee needs to document that at least 51% of the newly created positions are held by low to moderate income persons, or that they were made available to low to moderate income persons. In order to determine the percent of low to moderate income persons hired, the grantee must either document the income of the person taking the job, or that the person meets one of the low to moderate income presumption categories that we will discuss on the next slide. Remember that the salary of the newly created job is irrelevant for the purpose of determining low to moderate income job creation. The documentation of low to moderate income is based on the income of the new employee at the time he or she took the job. In other words, it is based on their existing family income and not on the new job that CDBG helped create. One of the most common and complex low to moderate income job creation and retention questions relates to the timeline and methods for counting new jobs. Units of general local government cannot set arbitrary numeric or time frame targets and simply stop counting at that point. Rather, the unit of general local government and the business must count all jobs that were created as a direct result of the CDBG-assisted activity. In addition, grantees must document the family income of the first person to take the newly created job, not the turnover in that same position. For example, assume that a unit of general local government is providing CDBG assistance to a new factory. The agreement between the unit of general local government and the factory estimates that 50 new jobs will be created during 2011, and that 30 of these jobs will be held by low to moderate income persons. Now assume that once the factory is built, the company's business takes off and it creates new positions each month. By the end of 2011, they had created 60 new positions and they were still growing. By June of 2012, they had stopped expanding, and at that point they had created a total of 80 new jobs, and new employees at that point were simply due to turnover in existing positions. In this example, the CDBG program would require that 51% of the 80 actual new jobs be held by low to moderate income persons. The unit of general local government could not stop counting, neither when they reached the original predicted jobs, nor could they stop when they reached the end of the planned one-year period. This is because new jobs are still being created, and these jobs were generated because of the CDBG investment in the factory. In addition, the unit of general local government or business is going to document the family income of the first person to take each of the 80 new jobs. They do not need to document the income of the people who take those same 80 positions when they turn over. For jobs that are retained, the unit of general local government must demonstrate that the job would be lost to the employee without the CDBG assistance. Of the retained jobs, 51% must be currently held by low-income persons, where that job can reasonably be expected to turn over in 2 years, and there is documentation that it would be filled by a low to moderate income person. In addition, the unit of general local government must document the steps it will take in order to ensure that the jobs will be made available to low to moderate income persons in the event that the jobs will turn over within 2 years. Jobs are considered to be made available if the following occurs. The business agrees that special skills or prerequisites are not a requirement for the job, or they hire unqualified persons and provide the training. The unit of general local government and business take actions to ensure that low to moderate income persons will receive the first consideration of the jobs. For some types of job creation or retention activities, the grantee can presume that the job taker is a low to moderate income person. If the hirees live in a census tract or block numbering area that has a poverty rate of at least 20% and has general distress, the grantee can presume that they are low to moderate income. If the hiree lives in an area that includes the central business district, the test is 30% poverty and general distress. The grantee may also presume that any job taker who lives in a HUD-approved empowerment zone or an enterprise community or an area that is 70% low to moderate income is a low to moderate income person. Alternately, if the business and the job are located in an area that is 20% poverty and has a general distress of 30% poverty and distress in the area, if it is a central business district, the grantee may assume that anyone hired by this business is low to moderate income. This flexibility is also offered if the business and job are located in a HUD-approved empowerment zone or enterprise community. Remember that this presumption only applies to the low moderate income jobs national objective and cannot be used for any other national objective. Some economic development projects can be qualified under national objectives other than low to moderate income job creation and retention. Microenterprise activities can be qualified under the low to moderate income limited clientele category if the owner of the business is low to moderate income. This is important because it does not require the unit of general local government or the microenterprise owner to track the jobs that they create. If the owner of the microenterprise is not low income, the project will typically be undertaken as a low to moderate income jobs activity. Job training activities are usually undertaken under the limited clientele national objective, especially job training programs that are funded as a public service activity. Other than job training and microenterprise, the low to moderate income limited clientele national objective cannot be used for economic development. Some economic development activities can be undertaken as low to moderate income area benefit activity. This is a little-known approach and is not commonly used for economic development, but it is certainly possible for some projects. The types of businesses that are likely to qualify under the low to moderate income area benefit national objective are retail businesses that sell goods and services to a low to moderate income area. For example, an area grocery store or pharmacy would likely qualify under the LMA category so long as their service area was primarily residential and at least 51% LMI. Industrial types of activities do not qualify under the low to moderate income area benefit because they do not provide a direct service to the residents of that area. In addition, some types of retail establishments will not qualify if they do not serve their area. For example, an expensive jewelry store, even if located in a low to moderate income area, would not count under the area benefit. Finally, some economic development activities can be undertaken as an area slum and blight activity if the activity is related to addressing the blight. Spot slum and blight is only possible for commercial rehabilitation, and this national objective limits the type and level of rehab that can be conducted. As stated earlier, most economic development activities typically qualify under the low and moderate income jobs national objective. However, some activities may qualify under other low and moderate income national objectives. A few examples are listed on the slide. It is also possible for economic development projects to meet the slum blight national objective. It is extremely rare for an economic development project to qualify under the urgent need national objective. I will now turn this time over to Diane Labasso, who will discuss the evaluation of economic development projects and other important things grantees need to be aware of when undertaking economic development projects. And while she sets up, just as another reminder, this is an opportunity for you to send in any questions that you have about any of the material that I have discussed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let's now move on from eligible activities and national objectives to the HUD requirements for evaluating economic development projects. There are two approaches to economic development project analysis that are described in the CDBG regulations. The first are a set of voluntary underwriting standards that HUD suggests grantees use when evaluating potential projects. The second are the public benefit standards. These are a set of mandatory numeric caps that mandate a minimum level of beneficiaries given the level of CDBG investment. In Appendix A of the CDBG regulations, HUD provides voluntary underwriting guidelines that provide suggestions for the types of criteria that a state may use when evaluating proposed economic development activities. HUD does not require that states use these guidelines. However, we do require that if the state or unit of general local government will not use these underwriting guidelines, that they conduct basic financial underwriting prior to the provision of CDBG financial assistance to a for-profit business. The underwriting guidelines in Appendix A are fairly basic and are likely to already be part of the review that the state or unit of general local government's underwriting staff currently undertake. The first guideline requires that a grantee assess that all project costs are reasonable. Even if the underwriting guideline did not suggest this criterion, the state or unit of general local government would still need to document this in order to comply with the regulations. The second guideline suggests that all of the financing be committed to the project. This requirement helps to ensure that the project will be completed because it will have sufficient resources. Next, the guidelines suggest that the CDBG funds not take the place of other non-federal funds. This is consistent with the statute and OMB directives, which seek to ensure that CDBG is additive and that units of general local government do not simply swap one public source of funding for another. The guidelines also suggest that the grantee ensure that the project is financially viable. As mentioned earlier, CDBG resources are limited, and it's unlikely that a grantee would invest this resource without evaluating feasibility. On a somewhat related note, most grantees will also assess whether the applicant business will get a windfall as a result of the CDBG investment and that their return is reasonable. To conduct this assessment, grantees may wish to look at other similar and comparable economic development private market deals. Finally, the guidelines suggest that the CDBG funds should be dispersed on a pro rata basis with all other funds in the project. This simply seeks to avoid the problem where CDBG resources are drawn down and invested in a project before other funds are used. The concern is that if other funders back out and the project is not completed, the grantee will need to repay the CDBG money back to the U.S. Treasury. Okay, now let's move from the voluntary underwriting guidelines to the mandatory public benefit standards. In addition to the voluntary underwriting criteria, the CDBG regulations require that some types of economic development projects show a sufficient level of outcome in return for the CDBG investment. The public benefit standards are triggered by 4 types of economic development activities. In the state CDBG program, these standards are applicable to activities that are eligible for assistance under Section 105A17 of the Act, economic developments eligible under Section 105A14, activities that are part of a community economic development project eligible under Section 105A15 of the Act, and also the public benefit standards are triggered for infrastructure projects under 105A2, undertaken in order to create jobs where more than $10,000 per job of CDBG assistance is provided. Some types of economic development activities do not trigger the public benefit standards. Microenterprise and commercial rehabilitation activities do not trigger these requirements as long as they are not combined in the same project as one of the types of activities I've already described. The state and the unit of general local government must maintain documentation to demonstrate the level of public benefit, and this will be further discussed in a minute. The regulations establish two different options for meeting the public benefit standards. Depending on the types of activities they are funding, the state may choose among these two approaches. The first public benefit option is to demonstrate that the selected activity created or retained a sufficient number of jobs. There are several things to note about this approach. Notice that this standard is not related to low and moderate income jobs, but rather any jobs. So this is an important distinction. So when the public benefit approach is calculated, total full-time equivalents created or retained are determined, not the number of jobs for LMI persons. Also remember that the public benefit standard is a different analysis than the national objective analysis. So assistance to a for-profit business could be undertaken under the LMI area benefit national objective, but could use the job creation public benefit standard. For example, imagine that the unit of general local government is assisting a small lender to open up a branch office in a low-income neighborhood. That activity may not create very many jobs for low and moderate income persons, and so its national objective might be area benefit. However, when it came time to look at the public benefit standard, the state could count the jobs that were created for the branch manager, the tellers, the security guards, and others, even though these folks were not low and moderate income persons. So the state might choose to use the job creation public benefit standard. The second approach to demonstrating a public benefit is to show that the activity provided goods and services to an area of LMI persons. When this part of the regulations discusses goods and services, it generally means retail or consumer services activities. This does not necessarily mean that all of the low and moderate income persons in the service area of the activity will shop at the assisted business, but rather that they reasonably could if they so chose. This approach to public benefit is not appropriate for retail activities that do not actually serve low and moderate income persons. For example, if the unit of general local government assisted a high-end gourmet grocery store to locate in a gentrifying low and moderate income area, this activity would not likely provide goods and services to low and moderate income persons. Obviously, this approach is not appropriate for industrial types of activities which do not directly provide goods and services to their local area. As was the case with the first approach to the public benefit standards, this approach is not tied to the use of any one particular national objective. It logically goes with the low and moderate income area benefit national objective, but other national objectives are also possible. There are two levels of public benefit standards, individual and aggregate, and grantees who fund activities that trigger the standards must meet both. The first level is tied to each and every project funded by the state where the public benefit standards have been triggered. The second level is calculated on the aggregate and applies to all funds distributed from each annual grant. This includes the amount of the annual grant, any reallocated funds, program income, and any guaranteed loan funds covered in the method of distribution. The next slides in this presentation will focus on how to calculate each of these caps. As mentioned, the individual standards are applied to every project where the public benefit standards have been triggered. The state is permitted to determine whether the project meets the goods and services test or the jobs test. The jobs public benefit cap indicates that a state may not obligate and notice the word obligate, may not obligate more than $50,000 of CDBG assistance per full-time equivalent that is created or retained. The reason I said to note obligate is to follow up on Steve Roadside's comment. I know we have a lot of entitlements on this webinar. To make sure that as you listen to this webinar, there are some differences in this area for entitlement grantees. For states, we're talking about obligations here. A key thing to note about this calculation is that it caps the level of CDBG investment in the project. It does not cap any non-CDBG funds that may be invested in the project. Also, as mentioned previously, this cap is based on any full-time equivalents that are created, not just jobs for low and moderate income persons. The second option indicates that states cannot obligate more than $1,000 of CDBG funds per low and moderate income person in the service area for the assisted business. To determine whether the business meets the test, the grantee will need to document the appropriate service area and the number of low and moderate income persons in that area. As we have discussed, this test is not based on the actual people who shop at the assisted business. Some activities will both create jobs and provide goods and services to an LMI, low and moderate income area. For example, assume that the grantee has funded a new supermarket to move into a low and moderate income area. That supermarket will hire staff and it will sell goods to low and moderate income residents. In these instances, the grantee can calculate the public benefit under each approach and select whichever it believes is more appropriate. The project will only fail the public benefit test if it exceeds both caps. It is acceptable for a project that creates jobs and provides services to exceed one of the caps as long as it meets the other. The public benefit standards are applied at the time the unit of general local government obligates CDBG funds to the project. So at that time, the grantee makes a good faith effort to estimate the likely public benefit and document their analysis in the file. The state is not required to go back and alter this analysis once the project is complete, assuming that they use reasonable prudence in making the initial assessment. However, if the grantee chronically estimates the public benefit, HUD may ask the state to improve its project analysis procedures. Note that if the only activity that is funded by the grantee is job training, HUD allows the grantee to count the number of people who were trained as if they were jobs created or retained. So this allows the grantee to be able to fund those types of programs even though the trainees may or may not get actual jobs. Also note that the regulations explicitly list several types of activities that CDBG does not believe offer a sufficient public benefit under any circumstance. The first of these is an activity in which the unit of general local government promotes the community as a whole, as opposed to a promotion of specific areas or programs. For example, this would include campaigns that market a specific town as a great place to work or live. In addition, CDBG may not be used to assist a professional sports team or a privately owned recreational facility that serves a predominantly higher income clientele, where the recreational benefit to members clearly is greater than the employment or other benefits to low and moderate income persons. The next type of activity that does not have a sufficient public benefit is acquisition of land for which the specific proposed use has not been identified. In other words, the grantee cannot land bank for economic development purposes. Finally, the grantee cannot provide assistance to a for-profit business while that business or any other business owned by the same person is the subject of an unresolved state, HUD, or Inspector General findings of noncompliance relating to previous CDBG assistance. In summary, under no circumstances can CDBG economic development funds be used to assist any of these previously mentioned types of projects. In addition to the public benefit test on each assisted project, the CDBG regulations impose a more stringent test on the state's entire economic development program for funds distributed for applicable activities from each annual grant when these standards have been triggered. This annual grant analysis is known as the aggregate public benefit test. The aggregate test is calculated for both the goods and services approach and the jobs approach. Under the jobs approach, the average level of CDBG assistance cannot exceed $35,000 per full-time equivalent job created or retained. Notice that this is significantly lower than the $50,000 test that is imposed on each project. So the implications of this lower cap are that if the grantee undertakes some projects where they obligate more than $35,000 per job, they must also do some projects at less than $35,000 per job, so that when the year's allocation is expended, the average does not exceed $35,000 per job cap. Similarly, the aggregate cap for goods and services test is $350 of CDBG assistance per low and moderate income person in the service area. So the grantee would also need to manage this process to ensure that the cap is not exceeded when the grantee's allocation is exhausted. In order to avoid any concerns about making these aggregate caps, some states simply limit their obligations to the aggregate cap. Thus, for example, they never obligate funds for activities that cost more than $35,000 per job. That way, they are assured of meeting the cap. This is a local policy decision, and it is not a HUD requirement. If they wish, grantees may use the $50,000 cap for specific projects. The aggregate public benefit standards are applied to all activities that are obligated by the grantee against a given grant or appropriation year. So this calculation is not related to when the CDBG funds are actually spent. In order to calculate the aggregate standard, the grantee will sort its projects into two categories: those that created jobs and those that provided goods and services. If an activity met both tests, the grantee must assign it to one group or the other, but not both. Then, for all activities under the job creation category, the grantee will add up all of the CDBG funds that were obligated on these activities and the total number of full-time equivalent jobs estimated to be created or retained at the time of obligation. The grantee will then calculate an average cost per full-time equivalent across all of these projects that were obligated against that grant year. That average cannot exceed $35,000. Similarly, for the goods and services test, the grantee will add up the total CDBG obligations for applicable activities. Then it will add up the total number of low and moderate income persons in the service area of these activities. Finally, the grantee will create an estimate average of the CDBG funds per person, and this cannot exceed $350. When the grant allocation has been completely obligated, if the grantee has activities under both types of tests, it must meet both caps. It is not acceptable for the grantee to meet one test but exceed the other. Some targeted types of activities can be exempted from the annual aggregate test. However, these activities must still meet the individual project test. Examples of activities that may be exempted include projects which provide jobs predominantly for residents of public and Indian housing or for homeless persons, or projects which provide jobs predominantly for persons residing within a census tract or block numbering area that has at least 20% of its residents who are in poverty. There are several other types of activities that can be exempted, and I encourage you to read the regulations for a complete list. Under the documentation requirements at 24 CFR 570.482 F6, state must keep records on the amount of public benefit that is actually achieved and how that compares to what was estimated at the time the funds were obligated. If the unit of general local government's estimates are off significantly, the state and the unit of general local government are expected to take steps within their control to improve the accuracy of its projections. If the actual results show that the state has failed the public benefit standards, HUD may require the state to meet a more stringent standard in the future years as appropriate. Okay, well now we're going to move on to some other topics here. Now that we've covered the basic requirements, we want to make you aware of 3 other that could impact economic development projects. The first is the restriction on the use of CDBG funds for employer relocation activities, commonly termed the restriction on anti-pirating. The second is the prohibition on the use of CDBG funds to support any federal, state, or local project that seeks to use the power of eminent domain unless that power is sought for certain public uses. The third concerns the use of state CDBG funds that benefit entitlement community residents. We will first discuss employer relocation. CDBG funds cannot be used to directly assist a business, including a business expansion, in the relocation of a plant, facility, or operation from one labor market to another labor market if the relocation is likely to result in a significant loss of jobs in the labor market from which the relocation occurs. A few important things to be noted are the definitions of the terms direct assistance, labor market area, and significant loss of jobs. We will cover these briefly, but I urge you to review the details in the regulations at 570-482H. Direct assistance means the provision of assistance to a for-profit business in exchange for completing a project that results in a relocation from one labor market to another. Labor market area, by definition, is an economically integrated geographic area where individuals can live and work within a reasonable distance or can readily change employment without changing their place of residence. A list of labor market areas can be obtained from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In non-metro areas, a state may choose to use the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, definition of a labor market area, or it may combine labor market areas if that gives a more accurate definition of the true commuting area for that portion of the state. States are required to define the labor market areas and retain records to substantiate areas prior to any business relocation that would be impacted by this regulation. It is important to keep in mind that a state can be more restrictive in its definitions. For example, a state can forbid units of general local government from using state CDBG funds to fund any business relocation if the state so chooses. Finally, and most importantly, significant loss of jobs means any job loss of 500 jobs or more in the labor market area from which the relocation occurs. A job loss of 25 or fewer jobs does not constitute a significant loss of jobs. Job losses between 25 and 500 must be less than 0.1% of the labor force in the losing area, in the areas losing the jobs to avoid being counted as significant. Before providing assistance to a business, the recipient, subrecipient, or 105A15 nonprofit organization shall sign a written agreement which must include a statement from the business indicating whether the assisted activity will result in the relocation of any plant, facility, or operation, and if so, the number of jobs that will be relocated from each labor market area. If the assistance will not result in a relocation, the business shall be required to sign a certification that neither it nor its subsidiaries has plans to relocate jobs at the time the agreement is signed that would result in a significant job loss. We are almost wrapping up here. Just have a couple more things to cover, and then we will get to some questions. Okay, so we talked about job pirating. Now I'm going to move on to the prohibition of the use of CDBG funds with eminent domain. States need to be aware of the prohibition of the use of CDBG funds to support any federal, state, or local project that seeks to use the power of eminent domain unless that power is sought for certain public uses. Public use does not include economic development projects that primarily benefit private entities. This prohibition was enacted through an administrative provision starting with the FY 2006 appropriation year, responding to the June 2005 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Kelo versus the City of New London. This case involved the exercise of eminent domain authority by the City of New London, Connecticut, to condemn privately owned real property so that the property could be used as part of a comprehensive development plan that would help revitalize the economy. The Supreme Court held that the power of eminent domain can be used to transfer private property to new private owners in furtherance of an economic development plan without violating the public use requirement of the Fifth Amendment. This prohibition appears in the HUD appropriations subsequent to 2006 and, or in the case of omnibus appropriations, language indicating that prior year restrictions apply. So how does this affect projects grantees are looking to undertake? In practical terms, this means that grantees funding certain economic development activities, such as acquisition, provision of assistance to a for-profit business to carry out economic development, installation of commercial or industrial real property improvements, et cetera, need to be aware that these activities may involve the exercise of eminent domain and that the grantee will have to evaluate the facts of any proposed project to ensure that this prohibition is not violated. States are encouraged to consult with HUD field staff on any such projects. Finally, states should take note that state CDBG funds must, by statute, be used to benefit non-entitlement areas. Entitlement communities receive their own allocation of money for use in these specific communities. We realize, however, that it might make sense to locate certain projects intended to benefit non-entitlement residents in an entitlement community, and thus benefits would accrue to the entitlement community residents. We encourage states to work with field offices and headquarters on any projects that do not predominantly benefit non-entitlement grantees. In addition, the state must carefully review unit of general local government applications to ensure that they have identified the community development and housing needs of non-entitlement areas, and the activity that they apply for will meet those needs. This concludes our overview of using state CDBG funds to promote economic development. Prior to responding to the questions we've received, I want to direct your attention to the list of resources that we covered in this webinar today. Thank you for viewing this webinar, and I encourage you to continue to use CDBG funds to create economic opportunities for low and moderate income persons. It is an important way that CDBG contribute to the economic recovery. As we mentioned earlier, please continue to submit your questions for the March 30th webinar to cdbgedquestions@hud.gov mailbox. We have already received several questions, and we'll be going through them and making a decision on which ones we will present at the March 30th webinar. In addition to this webinar, HUD will be developing additional guidance on economic development. Thank you, and now we can, I believe, begin the question and answer period. Transition a little bit here, and we'll see if we've received any questions.
Could ICF give instructions again as to how to ask questions?
Of course. The Q&A box is at the top left-hand corner of the live meeting screen. In order to ask a question, you must type it into the Q&A box, and the presenters will receive these questions and will address them as they come in. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll just take and see if folks are going to submit some questions. We already got a few, right, James?
Okay, the first question was about when I was discussing jobs that were currently held by, I discussed a couple of items that should be done in order to claim that the jobs were made available to. This was on a slide where we just had a line that said 51% of the jobs must be for LMI persons. The regulatory site for that, if you want to look it up, for more detail is at 570, 483, B, 4, 3 little I. And just to kind of summarize what the regulations state is that the jobs are going to be considered made available to LMI people if the business agrees that special skills or prerequisites are not a requirement for the job, or they hire unqualified persons and provide the training. The second part of that is that the unit of general local government and business take actions to ensure that the low to moderate income persons will receive first consideration for the jobs. So both of those, that's both an agreement and a documentation item that they have to show. The second question is, did the presenter say that slums and blight could only be used under commercial rehab and not as an economic development activity? That is, regardless of meeting the public benefit of job creation retention is required, can the national objective of slums and blight be applied to commercial rehab activity as opposed to other economic development activities? So the short answer to that is no. You can also do that under, for example, under 105A17, if you were to do acquisition and clearance, if you're assisting a for-profit business who's going to install a commercial or industrial building.
While we're waiting for other questions, I just had a couple of comments I wanted to make. One, the last time we looked at the cost per job in the state CDBG program, it was somewhere around $4,500 to $5,000 a job. So that's way under requirements and the public benefit standards, which is good. The other thing that I just wanted to point out is if a state does not do a lot of economic development, they have to be careful because if their aggregation is only 1 or 2 economic development grants, if they go over the limit for the aggregate, but they're under the limit for individual activities, that could cause a problem, because if you have one project and that project is at $50,000 a job, then your average is $50,000 a job. Are there any other questions?
I have a common one that we've received we receive over and over again, and the question is it true that public benefit standards are only triggered by the use of the job creation and retention national objective? No. The trigger really has nothing to do with the national objective. There are 2 sets of requirements. The public benefit standards are triggered by certain types of eligible activities that I described earlier. There are some activities that could be undertaken under the job creation national objective that would not need to meet the public benefit standard. For example, a commercial rehabilitation activity might be done probably under the low-mod jobs national objective, but it wouldn't trigger the public benefit standard. On the other hand, some other types of economic development activities are undertaken under the slums and blight national objective, but they would still trigger the public benefit standard. This area is very, very technical, and as I was going over my presentation, I realized maybe the next time we do this, we should do public benefit standards first. But I encourage you to review the slides. We will be posting them on the CDBG pages in the next couple of days. This webinar has been recorded, and also the state guide to eligible activities has some real good examples in there and how to calculate the public benefit standards. Also, there's an economic development toolkit. The slide that we currently have up right now, we have the last bullet is the economic development toolkit. It's about 300 pages and has many examples of everything that we've discussed today. So I don't know if we have any other questions at this point. Steve, do we get any other questions? Or?
Somebody had asked about the service area of facade improvements. And basically, that would depend on what the business is, and there would be the service area of the business. And so the market area would be determined by unit of general local government in consultation with the business.
I've got a question here that deals with microenterprises. First one would like to know why this section of the regulations is so flexible, and how can the grantee take advantage of this flexibility? So this is one of the more flexible types of CDBG assistance. The history of this was a congressional recognition that a substantial portion of the new jobs in America are created by small businesses. In addition, opening their own business can be a significant way to build wealth and assets for low to moderate income business owners. The eligibility category gives grantees significant flexibility so they can foster the development of new businesses in their communities. But in order to participate, states need to set up a separate microenterprise program, both in their consolidated action plans, including in the method of distribution and an IDIS. The state cannot commingle this program with other types of economic development programs. If the unit of general local government wants the microenterprise flexibilities, it cannot just operate one general economic development program that services all sizes of businesses. And as we mentioned in the presentation, to be eligible under the microenterprise section of the CDBG statute and regulations, this program must be separately established by the state and be listed in its method of distribution.
I'd like you to think, as a result of this, if you have any questions, especially those that are involving scenarios that are kind of complicated, that would be a good thing to send in to us to discuss in our March 30th webinar. That webinar is going to be sort of a reprise where we're going to have the folks from the Entitlement Division, the folks that were doing this webinar from the State and Small Cities Division, and the 108 Division all combined to try to field all the questions and answer them. So think about what you would like to ask us for March 30th.
And next week, we will have the webinar on the Section 108 program, and our colleagues from the Financial Management Division will be providing a similar presentation and be able to take some questions at the end of the webinar on the Section 108 program.